Hello everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I've got another pile of books to chat about with you. I'm answering one of my most frequently asked questions, which is what are my favourite funny reads? And especially, what are my favourite examples of books that show a very British sense of humour? So I've gathered together some real classic British books that have me laughing out loud and that I absolutely love. So most of these books are real classics. They're mainly also set before 1960, I think, although there are a couple exceptions to that. But they're all ones that I've loved for years and I can't wait to share them with you. So first of all, what really started my love for entertaining, funny books are the Just William books by Richmore Crompton. These are children's books, but they can absolutely be read by adults as well. I still love to read these, and I love to listen to Martin Jarvis reading the stories on Audible. They're completely hilarious, and I so recommend them. There's a whole series about William, who is a young schoolboy who is very naughty and he gets into all sorts of mischief along with his friends, the outlaws. And how William gets himself out of trouble almost every time makes for really entertaining, hilarious, in fact, reading. I absolutely love these stories and I read these as a child, first of all, and they really set me up to go on to love authors like P.G. Wodehouse. If you enjoy P.G. Wodehouse, then you would love these too. It's a real problem-solving type of story as well, which I really enjoy. I think that's partly why I love mysteries so much. But a lot of these sorts of books that are really funny also generally centre around some kind of predicament or problem that William has to solve and get himself out of, and that adds a lot to the drama. But I love that aspect to them, and they're generally written as a collection of short stories, so they're great books to just dip in and out of because they just read like short stories, and there's this little problem that William has to solve in each one, and I absolutely adore them. I also really liked the Jennings books when I was little by Anthony Buckeridge, and sadly I don't have my copies of those books anymore. The ones I had are still in New York, but if you like Just William and you haven't read Jennings, then I would suggest giving them a go. They're more school-based than the Just Williams books, and I don't think they're quite as funny, but they're still really good. And then again, if you like Just William, then Molesworth is another classic. So Molesworth by Geoffrey Willans and Ronald Searle. Ronald Searle did the incredible illustrations that really add to the hilarity of the Molesworth stories. There's an example for you. These are very, very funny school stories written by a mischievous young boy again who cannot spell, but how he recounts some of the adventures and the masters that teach him at St. Custard's is really hilarious, and these definitely have me laughing out loud a lot. They're really, really funny. Like I said, reading Just William set me up to absolutely love P.G. Wodehouse as I got a bit older. P.G. Wodehouse is still my go-to author for when I really need cheering up and I just want something that makes me laugh. I've been listening to him recently because it's felt a little bit like one thing after another for me lately. Nothing's been going seriously wrong, but there have just been a lot of mishaps, and like we're currently without a boiler, so no heating and no hot water. And I've been turning to P.G. Wodehouse right now because I've just needed that extra cheer in my life at the moment. I adore his Jeeves and Wooster series. Bertie Wooster is a not too bright, wealthy young man, and Jeeves is his gentleman's personal gentleman. i.e. his manservant. And whenever there's friction in the Worcester household, it's generally because Bertie has chosen an inappropriate article of clothing to wear, and Jeeves is not amused. But fortunately for Jeeves, Bertie is always getting himself into scrapes that generally involve him becoming engaged to a young woman that he does not want to be engaged to. And Jeeves is there on hand to help him get out of trouble, and he generally manages to wheedle his own way and get Bertie to discard the unwanted item of clothing at the end of the story. So, a bit like the Just William stories, the P.G. Wodehouse books follow a particular structure. Some of them are novels, and some are a collection of short stories. I love all of them. I mean, he's such an amazing short story writer, P.G. Wodehouse. I love the Jeeves and Worcester short stories, but I also really like the Mr Malina books. The first one is Meet Mr Malina, and this is a collection of short stories. I love Eggs, Beans and Crumpets. That's a fantastic short story collection, all about members of the Drones Club, which is also Bertie Wooster's club. And I love his golfing short stories, which is maybe surprising because I know literally nothing about golf, but they're some of the funniest stories. And again, there's this element of sort of a problem to solve in each story that reminds me of why I love mysteries so much. There's not a mystery in these books, but there is a problem to solve. And P.G. Wodehouse is just the most amazing writer of plots. How he works out this really intricate entanglement and then gets his characters out of it again is just incredible. I'm always in awe by his very complicated and hilarious plot lines. So really recommend those. But I'm a fan also of the Blandings Castle series by him. These are absolutely brilliant. And I love the Smith in the City books. I love Buckeridge. There's so many that I love. I really do enjoy his writing so much. So I had to highlight P.G. Wodehouse. And also I listened to the Jonathan Cecil versions of the books on Audible, which I've mentioned before, but if you're new to my channel, I want to mention that again. The P.G. Wodehouse books read by Jonathan Cecil on Audible are just pitch perfect. I listen to a lot of comic novels like the ones I'm describing on Audible because they're some of my favourite comfort reads. But I also think that with a funny book, the reader is even more important because they have to be perfect on timing. They just have to get those characters' voices right. They have to understand the pacing of the dialogue. So when that's right, it's just so good. And I think it actually adds to your pleasure of a book when it's read really well and it's a funny book. So Jonathan Cecil reading P.G. Wodehouse is, in my opinion, the best, and Martin Jarvis reading Just William is also absolutely brilliant. Martin Jarvis also reads Three Men in a Boat, although actually I think it's Ian Carmichael. Yes, it's Ian Carmichael I have reading Three Men in a Boat. I think there's maybe... No, I know what Martin Jarvis reads. I'll share that with you later. It's Ian Carmichael reading Three Men in a Boat on Audible that is brilliant. I've read this as well. It's one of my favourites by Jerome K. Jerome. If you love P.G. Wodehouse, you would really like this as well. It's all about a rather hopeless set of young men who are friends, who gather together and they decide to take a trip together boating along the Thames. And it starts off hilariously with them planning the trip and packing provisions, and there are so many funny scenes in this book. It's also a wonderful depiction of late Victorian, early Edwardian England. So it's a beautiful snapshot of a bygone world, and there's so much to enjoy about it, but there's so many moments as well that have me absolutely roaring with laughter. There's a very funny scene in which one of the men describes singing comic songs as entertainment at a party, and that is the most perfect dialogue in that scene. It's just so funny. Another favourite of mine is when one of the young men gets lost in the Hampton Court maze. That is absolutely brilliant as well. There are just these classic moments of real laugh out loud comedy that I so enjoy. So yes, Three Men in a Boat and Their Dog is a real classic of comic English literature, so I really recommend that one. And then if you like Three Men in a Boat, I would really recommend this book called The Ascent of Rum Doodle by, I think it's W.E. Bowman. Yes, W.E. Bowman. And this is a real parody on the mountaineering type book. It was written in the 1950s. There's definitely a nod to Three Men in a Boat with this book. Again, it starts with a group of somewhat ill-assorted men who get together and they plan this expedition that they're all going to go on. Though, of course, one of them, who is meant to be the route finder for the journey, never turns up because he gets hopelessly lost in London. And that sort of sets the scene for what will happen. It's a group of them. One is a leader. And one of the favourite lines in the book for me is the leader of the expedition, as they're about to set off up this mountain, Rum Doodle, which is an imaginary mountain in the Himalayas, and he sits and contemplates on the qualities of leadership, which, as he said, means that he followed up at the rear. And there are so many funny lines in this one. It is complete sort of parody. It's a real spoof and it's very light-hearted. It's quite of its time in many ways as well, but it really is quite a hilarious read too. They fuel the whole trip on champagne. They essentially just get drunk going up this mountain. The leader is completely oblivious of this. He thinks the champagne is for medicinal purposes and doesn't understand that the rest of the men are mercilessly teasing him half the time and stealing all of the champagne. And their altitude sickness is generally down to drinking far too much of the medicinal supplies. And there are moments when, for instance, he talks about the value of them using the walkie-talkies in emergencies, such as someone having to contact someone else to ask where the corkscrew is. So it really is just very light-hearted, but very funny. And yes, one I recommend. And then two books that remind me a little bit of P.G. Wodehouse in some ways are These Mysteries by Joan Coggin. I actually have 4 of them. I've spoken about this one before called Who Killed the Curate because it's a murder mystery set over Christmas, so I mentioned this when I was talking about books to read at Christmas. But there are others in the series. This is another, The Mystery at Orchard House, set just before World War II. And Lady Lupin in these books is very much a bit of a Bertie Wooster type character. She is a bit of an airhead. She loves cocktail parties, but she ends up marrying a vicar moving from London to the countryside. And the first one in the series is Who Killed the Curate, and there's some hilarious antics that poor Lady Lupin gets involved in. There's a very funny bit where she's meant to give a speech to a girls' guide meeting, and it all goes horribly wrong. But in spite of not being the brightest spark always, she does often help to solve mysteries, well, murders in fact, that take place in the village and at her friends' houses and things like that. So they're really entertaining reads, but there are some very funny scenes in these as well. And then The Diary of a Nobody is another absolute gem of a book, a real favourite of mine, a wonderful classic example of British comedy. There's a lot of understated humour in this one, and this is the one that is read by Martin Jarvis. and is available on Audible, and I so recommend it. It's absolutely hilarious and he does a brilliant job at reading this. This is set, well, it was written in the late Victorian times, and again it's a wonderful snapshot of a bygone era. I absolutely love the domestic detail that comes out in this book. It was also one of the first novels, I believe, that really took advantage of the diary form, especially in comic writing. And the nobody in this case is a very ordinary man living a very ordinary middle class kind of life. But what makes this book funny is how oblivious he often is to other people's opinions of him and to others' motivations. And a lot of that understated, quiet humour just comes out so well in this book, and it definitely has me chuckling a lot. I love the descriptions of his interactions with his wife and son and his son's new fiancée, as well as tradespeople and things like that that he encounters and often gets on the wrong side of. But there's so much that is just utterly charming, but also very, very funny in this book. So I really recommend that one. And then talking of funny books written in diary form, well, you can probably guess what is coming next. And that is The Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield. Again, this is such a wonderful classic example of British humour. I absolutely adore this book. It's all about a woman who is married with a family, and she has to try to keep up appearances on a very dwindling budget in the sort of 1930s in Britain. And she writes absolutely hilariously about her life in a village in the English countryside, about her neighbours, like the infamous Lady B, about her French tutor for her children. There is just so many witty observations generally on the people around her and on life in general that are absolutely brilliant. I adore this book. It's a real favourite of mine, and yes, it's just such a gem. If you've never read it, you're really in for a treat because it is wonderful. And then if you like The Diary of a Provincial Lady, I have a few suggestions that are on a very similar vein to my mind and that are funny. I don't think they're quite as funny as The Diary of a Provincial Lady. The humour is a bit quieter. It's maybe more of a little chuckle rather than a huge laugh out loud moment for me, but there are some very good books to recommend. So the first is Mrs. Tim of the Regiment by D.E. Stevenson. There's a lot of quiet humour to D.E. Stevenson's writing. I love her Miss Bunkle books, which are very funny too. But Mrs. Tim of the Regiment reminds me the most of Diary of a Provincial Lady, and I absolutely love it. It's written in diary format, and it's about a young army wife, and again there are so many brilliant observations on the sort of social situations she finds herself in, on the people in her neighbourhood and whom she interacts with. She's a really charming character as well. And yes, it's just a really brilliant book. I think the marriage in this one is rather happier than the marriage in The Diary of a Provincial Lady. But it's such a charming read. I really recommend it, and a lot of quiet, gentle humour in this one as well, which I love. And then again, I find this book similar to The Diary of a Provincial Lady, and it's Henrietta's War by Joyce Dennis. This is set during World War II. It's got some fabulous illustrations in it, which I love. And again, these add to the humour of the book for me. This is a novel told in letters. The Henrietta, who's a doctor's wife, writes to a friend of hers. And again, it's all about the village antics that she describes that make this such a funny read. And World War II is of course happening, so it's all about the villagers' reaction to the war and about them joining in the war effort, but there are a lot of trivial dramas as well that go on behind the scenes that she describes in these letters. And it's just, again, a very fun, entertaining read, so I very much recommend it. There's Henrietta Sees It Through as well, which is a follow-up to this, which is also really good, but Henrietta's War is the first one. And then I really love Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. Again, there are some charming illustrations in this book. I love illustrated books, so that's always a plus for me. And this is just a very funny Persephone book. It's about a governess who is one of the superfluous women during the interwar years. She hasn't been able to find a husband. She's having to work as a governess, and it's very hard, dreary work. And she was just one of the many women who found themselves in that situation in the interwar years. But one day her life changes completely, and she accidentally becomes employed as a maid to a young nightclub singer. And it's a real Cinderella story, because during the course of this day, Miss Pettigrew herself receives a complete makeover and her life just changes completely. There's a happy ending to this book, which I love as well. But before we get there, Miss Pettigrew finds herself in some really challenging and often hilarious situations. But throughout the book, her confidence in herself, in her judgment, and her hope for her future and her life really grows. And that adds so much to the charm of this story and makes it a really memorable read. It's one of my favourite Persephone books, so absolutely recommend that. I think it would cheer anybody up. And then another favourite of mine in this sort of vein is Business as Usual by Jane Oliver and Anne Stafford. Again, there are some really charming illustrations that add a lot to the story in this one. This is another epistolary novel, and it's about a young woman who is writing to her fiancé in Scotland. Over the course of their engagement, she's decided to go to London for a while to have a go at earning her own living. And she's working for a big department in London that's a sort of thinly disguised Selfridges. And she ends up getting a job in their book department, which is, of course, fabulous to anyone who loves books like I do. And I loved all of the details about working for a big department store at that time. I think this was written in the 1930s. And it's just really, really fascinating on that kind of period detail. But it's also very funny the way that she describes her colleagues as well as the clients that she has to deal with. There are so many funny incidents in this story, which I absolutely loved. And there's a bit of a twist to the love story in this one that I really enjoyed as well. So such a light-hearted, good-humoured book. I really recommend it. And then another absolute classic is the Map and Lucia books by E.F. Benson. This is the first in the series, Map and Lucia, and I think it's also the best. It's my real favourite. And it's about two women who live in Tilling, which is the fictionalised name of Rye in England, which is a beautiful seaside town. And I've been to Rye myself because I was such a fan of the Map and Lucia books that for years I was desperate to get to Rye to see all of the locations that are brilliantly described in this book. And Lucia and Miss Mapp are social rivals. They each want to be the Queen of Tilling, and they're very competitive with each other. And this leads to all sorts of drama between them, but it's absolutely hilarious. I just love E.F. Benson's writing, and again, this is a book that I'll turn to always when I need a smile put on my face. It's just so funny. I love it. And then this is a fairly recent discovery of mine, but again, a very funny book. It's Miss Carter and the Ifrit by Susan Alice Kirby. And this is about a woman. It's set during World War II. And again, there's some really fascinating period detail to the time, especially about rationing and all of the shortages and just sort of daily life during the war. That's really well drawn in this book. But then there's this strange sort of twist to the story when one day Miss Carter has a sort of genie, or Ifrit as it's called, emerge from her fireplace. And he's been released by a sort of log of wood that she's burning. And it sounds so silly, but it actually works. It's almost like a grown-up 5 children in it type of book, which I loved. And having this genie living in her flat causes poor Miss Carter all sorts of trouble. But in the end, it all works out for the best too. But much hilarity and madcap adventures ensue before that point. And yes, it's just quite an entertaining, light-hearted, funny read with a lot of great period detail too. So I recommend that one. And then I adore Gerald Durrell's writing. I couldn't find my copy of My Family and Other Animals, which is why I put this one in to just remind myself to talk about it. My Family and Other Animals is the first in his series of books all about his family getting completely fed up with the awful weather in England, moving to Corfu, and then all of the adventures that ensued. And Gerald Durrell was absolutely obsessed with all kinds of animals from a very young age. So Corfu was a sort of paradise to him. And there are some brilliant descriptions of nature in his books as well, which I love. But what make his books so funny are definitely his family. I mean, the characters he describes, his brothers, his sisters, poor mum. Oh, it's just so funny. He had such a family of eccentrics, and he just draws their characters so brilliantly, their eccentricities so brilliantly. And there are so many famous scenes in My Family and Other Animals which make me laugh no matter how many times I've read it before. Like the scene where Gerald has been keeping a scorpion and her babies in a matchbox, and his brother picks it up all unknowingly at the dinner party, and when he opens the matchbox, all of these scorpions come out, and the mayhem this causes at the dining table. It's just hilarious. And then sort of for months, if not years after, his poor brother was terrified of matchboxes and approached everyone with great caution in the household. But the real affection that the family all have for each other too just really comes out. And oh, it's such a hilarious book. My Family and Other Animals is my favourite. The first one is my favourite, but so many of the others are really good as well. And then when I think of Gerald Durrell, I also always think of James Herriot, because these books just have me laughing out loud so often too. I really love them. They're autobiographical novels about James Herriot's life. He was a vet in Yorkshire, and of course that makes these books even more special to me now that I'm living in Yorkshire, and I adore his descriptions of the Yorkshire Dales. Many of the books are set just before World War II. And what makes these books funny is again the people in them, and James Herriot's descriptions of his extremely eccentric boss Siegfried and his brother Tristan, as well as the local personalities and farmers. they're just brilliant, and they have been roaring with laughter so often. He is, of course, like Gerald Durrell, a real animal lover too, so there are some beautiful descriptions of farm life and of nature in his books, which I really enjoy too. But it's also the stories of the people of the Yorkshire Dales that are so memorable to me and that have me laughing and sometimes crying. But his books are absolutely wonderful. I can't recommend them enough. So that's a brilliant one. And then H.E. Bates is another favourite of mine, and his books, the Darling Buds of May series, are often very, very funny. I love the characters in these books. The Larkin family are just so full of life, so of all of the pleasures and joys of living, which is so wonderful. In the first one, a young man comes to try to get Pa Larkin to pay his taxes, and this young man ends up never leaving and eventually becomes a part of the family. But there are some very funny scenes in this. Again, there are also some beautiful descriptions of nature, of farm life in the English countryside. These books are set in Kent, and so they're very slim reads, but utterly delightful, and a lot of laugh out loud funny moments in them too. So really recommend that one. And then, of course, one of the classic examples of English comic writing to me is Jane Austen, because her humour is incredible, and her novels are full of that very British sense of humour in terms of they're so full of irony, sometimes satire as well. But I think her funniest book to me is Pride and Prejudice, which is full not only of understated, wry, ironic kind of humour, but also some laugh out loud funny scenes. I mean, I always laugh over Mr Collins's proposal to Elizabeth Bennet. That's one of my very favourite scenes in literature, and one of the funniest, I think. So I had to talk about Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice in particular. And then a lot of other novelists were inspired by Jane Austen, and their type of understated, somewhat wry, ironic sense of humour that's such a part of the British sense of humour too, really comes out in their writing. But they were heavily influenced by Jane Austen. So one of those writers was Nancy Mitford, and I wouldn't describe her books as really laugh out loud funny. There's a big difference between P.G. Wodehouse and Nancy Mitford, to my mind, but they're still very much in the British tradition of comic writing. And Nancy Mitford has a wonderful way of describing the eccentricities of people that is very like Jane Austen and is very funny, if in a sort of, slightly less laugh out loud funny kind of way. Her novels are still very amusing. There is a lot of sadness to some of her books as well, and they are darker than a lot of the ones that I've been talking about previously too. But there's also so much wit to her writing that I wanted to mention her, and The Pursuit of Love is the first book. Well, it's the book that I think is best to start with, and the first in her sort of series. So I would recommend that one. And then Barbara Pym is another writer who is often compared to Jane Austen. And again, her writing to me is full of that understated, slightly ironic kind of humour, which I really enjoy. So to me, again, there is also often some melancholy to her writing. I'm thinking in particular of The Quartet in Autumn, for instance, but it's always lightened by her incredible observations of people, the eccentricities of people, and I love that about her writing. She was such a wonderful study of character, I think, and that comes out so much in her books, which often gives for very funny situations and scenes. But I would say the humour in her books is more understated, but I still find them funny and they're wonderful reads. And then Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons is another example of brilliantly satirical writing. Stella Gibbons loved Jane Austen, and there are many nods to Jane Austen in Cold Comfort Farm. And again, this is full of that wry, satirical, rather understated sense of humour that I love. Cold Comfort Farm is a real classic. If you haven't read it, I very much recommend it. It's all about a young woman called Flora Post, who is a brilliant organiser, and she goes to stay with cousins of hers who live in Cold Comfort Farm. And she ends up tidying up all of their lives and sorting everything out. Their lives have really been rather a shambles, and the farm is a shambles before she gets there. But she introduces a washing up brush to them and so many other things, and just sorts them all out. But there is a lot of humour to this as well, and it's one of my favourite books, so I really recommend it. And then, of course, Georgette Hare, I find a really funny writer. And if you love Jane Austen, you would definitely enjoy Georgette Hare. And I think her books are often so amusing. They're very light-hearted in general too. More light-hearted than some of these others I've mentioned. I really recommend her for just light, entertaining reading. I recently reread Frederica by listening to it on Audible, and was reminded again of how funny it is. There are so many sort of madcap situations that happen in this one, but it's just really entertaining. So I love Georgette Hare's Regency romances for funny writing as well. And then some slightly more modern choices, but are very much in the same sort of style of British comic writing. I have to mention the Rumple books by John Mortimer. Annoyingly, I realised that I don't own them anymore. I must have, I don't know, they've disappeared during my many moves. So the only one I have right now is Rumple at Christmas, which is a collection of Christmas stories. But I listened to the Rumple books read by Leo McCann, which are absolutely brilliant, from a teenager. And I just loved them so much, and I started reading all of the books as well. And he reminds me in some ways of P.G. Wodehouse in that so many of the Rumple books are again written like a collection of short stories. Rumple is a barrister, a very intelligent barrister, who always tends to take the side of the underdog and has to solve very difficult cases many times, but he generally comes out winning, which is fantastic. But the way that he describes the judges he has to deal with, his colleagues, his wife, who he calls she who must be obeyed, his descriptions of London too, and the sort of after work drink, his bottle of Chateau Thames Embankment, as he calls it, the pub by the embankment. I mean, it's all so brilliant and so funny. And they remind me a bit of the P.G. Wodehouse books because there's this element of solving a problem in each story, which I absolutely love too. And John Mortimer is just a brilliant plot writer as well. You always wonder how Rumple's going to solve this case or get out of a difficulty at home or at work, and he always does. He's very wily and a really great character, and these books have me laughing out loud. They're absolutely brilliant, and Again, really interesting in their descriptions of life at the Old Bailey, of being a barrister in London at this time. There's just so much to enjoy about these books, and I really recommend them. And then another favourite of mine, it's more modern, is Love, Nina, Dispatches from Family Life by Nina Stibb. And these are a collection of letters that Nina Stibb wrote home to her sister when she moved to London as a young woman and got a job as an au pair. And her descriptions in these letters of being an au pair, which was really something she didn't know much about at all, and sort of starting to move within the crowd of London intelligentsia, is really funny. She met Alan Bennett, for instance. He'd come over for supper quite often and she didn't think that much of him. And there are just so many really funny descriptions of her life in London and the people that she met in this book. Nina Stibb has also written quite a few novels as well that are very funny too. I think she's just got a great flair for the comic. She's brilliant, but these letters are definitely my favourite, I think, of her writing. And then finally, I love the Alexander McCall Smith books. So many of his series I enjoy. I love the #1 Ladies Detective Agency books, the 44 Scotland Street books. I mean, I love all of his series, I think. But in terms of the funniest books, those for me have to be the Professor von Eaglefeld trilogy. And these books are all about a German linguistics professor. And I particularly enjoy these because I studied linguistics as an undergraduate myself. So there are some sort of like in-jokes about linguistics and stuff that probably only a linguistics person would really get. But I particularly enjoy the books for that reason. Professor von Eaglefeld takes himself very seriously, and a lot of the humour in this comes from him being such an oblivious character to the thoughts and the feelings of the people around him. And in many ways you feel very sorry for his long-suffering colleagues. But Professor von Eaglefeld finds himself in some truly extraordinary and hilarious situations, and he's just a brilliant comic character. Again, a lot of the comedy here is from things almost unwritten, left unsaid, but it's absolutely brilliant, and I have roared with laughter over these books. I think there are 3 of them, and they're collected in this edition, which is the 2.5 Pillars of Wisdom. I can't remember. Oh yeah, the first one is called Portuguese Irregular Verbs. Yeah, I absolutely adore these. You don't need to know anything about linguistics, by the way, to read this too. It's just if you happen to know a bit, then you'll find them even funnier. But yes, I so recommend these. But anyway, those are my books that I love, that I think showcase very British sense of humour. They're books that I turn to when I'm in need of a laugh and a bit of cheering up. So I hope that you've got some inspiration from my suggestions and that you can enjoy some of these books that might be new to you. I'm sure that many of these are favourites of yours as well. But do let me know any other books that you think I would find really funny. Thanks so much for watching my video. Do give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face that pops up over here on the screen. But I'll be back again soon with another video, so until then, goodbye.